I've chosen for your consideration this evening scripture from 2 Nephi, chapter 3, starting with verse 46. These verses are part of a prayer that Nephi was offering following the passing of his father Lehi. Awake, my soul. No longer droop in sin. Rejoice, O my heart, and give place no more for the enemy of my soul. Do not anger again because of mine enemies. Do not slacken my strength because of mine afflictions. Rejoice, O my heart, and cry unto the Lord, and say, O Lord, I will praise thee forever. Yea, my soul will rejoice in thee, my God, and the rock of my salvation. How much I appreciate very much the ministry of music and how it sets the tone of worship and it invites the Spirit. Thank you, Emma. Good evening. We welcome you to the house of the Lord and greet you in his name. I'm very thankful to be with you this evening. It's kind of a change for me this evening as far as my order is concerned. A good portion of what I have to share with you this evening is actually an experience, which I will share at the end in closing. In my opening scripture, I read from 2 Nephi, the 3rd chapter, and if you'd like to turn back there, I'm going to go back there more than once, where Nephi is offering a prayer. He's offering a prayer not long after his father Lehi had passed away. And in his heartfelt prayer, Nephi confesses that my soul grieves because of my iniquities. Nephi realizes that even though he's favored, that he's been blessed, he's also broken. Like we all are broken. That he sees the sin within his life. That he's confronted by the fact that his father has just passed away. He's dealing with his 2 older brothers, Laman and Lemuel, who have since the time of the departure from Jerusalem gave him nothing but trouble. And following the passing of their father, they once again are about ready to confront him and seek his life. And in the midst of all this chaos, he's suddenly confronted with his own weaknesses. Going back to the 3rd chapter of 2 Nephi, this time starting with the 29th verse. For my soul delighteth in the scriptures, and my heart pondereth them, and writeth them for the learning and the profit of my children. Behold, my soul delighteth in the things of the Lord, and my heart pondereth continually upon the things which I have seen and I have heard. Nevertheless, the great goodness of the Lord in showing me his great and marvelous works, my heart exclaimeth, O wretched man that I am. Yea, my heart sorroweth because of my flesh. My soul grieveth because of mine iniquities. I am encompassed about because of the temptations and the sins which doth so easily beset me. And when I desire to rejoice, my heart groaneth because of my sins. Nevertheless, I know in whom I have trusted. My God hath been my support. He hath led me through mine afflictions in the wilderness. He hath preserved me upon the waters of the great deep. He hath filled me with his love, even unto the consuming of my flesh. He hath confounded mine enemies unto the causing of them to quake before me. Behold, he hath heard my cry by day, and he hath given me knowledge by visions in the nighttime. And by day have I waxed bold in mighty prayer before him. Yea, my voice have I sent up on high, and angels came down and ministered unto me. And upon the wings of his Spirit hath my body been carried away upon exceeding high mountains. And my eyes have beheld great things, yea, even too great for man. Therefore I was bidden that I should not write them. O then, if I have seen so great things, if the Lord in his condescension unto the children of men hath visited me in so much mercy, why should my heart weep, and my soul linger in the valley of sorrow? And my flesh wasteth away, and my strength slackened because of mine afflictions. And why should I yield to sin because of my flesh? Yea, why should I give way to temptations that the evil one have placed in my heart to destroy my peace and afflict my soul? Why am I angry because of mine enemy? Awake, my soul. No longer droop in sin. Rejoice, O my heart, and give place no more for the enemy of my soul. Do not anger again because of mine enemies. Do not slacken my strength because of mine afflictions. Rejoice, O my heart, and cry unto the Lord, and say, O Lord, I will praise thee forever. Yea, my soul will rejoice in thee, my God and the rock of my salvation. Sometimes circumstances dictate change. As Nephi will ultimately find out, as he separates himself from his brothers Laman and Lemuel, I would expect that his older brothers reminded him that now that Dad is gone, we don't have to behave. We will not listen to you, nor will we hearken to your counsel. In fact, that was the very thing that Lehi had admonished him that they would do. The scriptures tell us that once again they saw his life, and I believe Nephi loved his brothers very much. And yet the Lord warns Nephi that he must depart from them. I'm sure with a heavy heart, Nephi makes the preparations for all of those of his family and for those who believed in the warnings and the revelations of God and would hearken to them. Awake, my soul. My father had a favorite quote or saying. He would often share it with my brother Thomas and myself, usually when we were interested in purchasing something. Yes, I know I called you Thomas. And I'm going to break a little-known family tradition this evening where I admit to something that I actually did. See, there have been accounts where history has tried to be adapted, rewritten. So I'm taking responsibility for this one. My father's quote went something like this: "A man that buys what he does not need will often need what he cannot buy." In fairness to our father, he was speaking from experience. He had grown up during the Depression. He had experienced going without. After the death of his mother at age 12, the family was largely divided up. A portion of the family went to one relative. Another portion of the family went to trusted acquaintances. The oldest son stayed at home. And we would hear our father often talk about how hard his father worked. He worked at a rock quarry for just a few cents an hour. And the reason I share that with you is just to give you a little perspective as far as where my dad was speaking from. A man that buys what he does not need will often need what he cannot buy. Our typical response would be, and I'm sure this is unusual to other households, but we would say, "Yes, Dad, we know," and would repeat the quote back in a less than positive tone. Then one time, Phil got a bright idea, so I thought, and it was out of that thinking that I repeated this back to him. "That's true, Dad. However, a man that needs what he cannot buy can often buy what he does not need." And I have to admit that when I repeated that back to him, I was feeling pretty proud of myself. We both gloated, we just bested Dad. We had taken those words of wisdom and we had turned them around, or we had changed them to our advantage. We were certainly proud of ourselves. But if you think about it, and if you repeat that quote again, "A man that buys what he does not need will often need what he cannot buy. A man that needs what he cannot buy will often buy what he does not need." When you examine both phrases, they contain the same words. My adaptation contains the same elements as the original. They're just organized differently. Superficially, it appears different, but the meaning remains unchanged. Often, once things are set in motion, there's our time constraints involved. I know there are men in the congregation that work construction, and I'm no expert when it comes to construction. However, when I was younger, I did rough in a few houses. And my brother and I both had opportunity to watch our father work with cement and concrete around the house. And I came to understand that certain things had to take place to produce the needed change for the concrete and for the cement to form, to harden. It required the correct ingredients and the support for a transformation from a sandy mix to a sure foundation. Imperfections would cause the footing or the anchor to be unsure. Returning to Nephi's prayer, he exclaims, "Rejoice, O my heart, and cry to the Lord, and say, O Lord, I will rejoice in thee, my God, and the rock of my salvation." Reading from Helaman, chapter 2, the 74th and the 75th verse. "And now, my sons, remember that it is upon the rock of our Redeemer, who is Christ, the Son of God, that you must build your foundation, that when the devil shall send forth his mighty winds, yea, his shafts in the whirlwind, yea, when all his hail and his mighty storm shall beat upon you, it shall have no power over you, to drag you down to the gulf of misery and endless woe, because of the rock upon which you are built, which is a sure foundation, a foundation whereon if men build, they cannot fall." In the year 2015, what change do we want to take place in our life? Will it be daily devotions, our New Year's resolutions? Will it be a year of truly transforming change within our lives and our homes, or good intentions? This past Sunday, I attended the POZ, and I'm going to have to admit something. I absolutely despise acronyms. There's so many of them out there, and a lot of them are so similar. Priesthood of Zion gathered together, and it was a wonderful experience. At least it was for me. I did not know many of the men in attendance, and I proceeded to introduce myself when Tom was not introducing me to some of the men that I had met. One of the gentlemen that stood up and shared a testimony about an hourglass intrigued me. He went on to share how that the time for change had nearly run out. In his experience, there was but a few grains of sand left in the hourglass. I found it very interesting since I had considered finding an hourglass and actually bringing it up front with me this evening and placing it on the pulpit. It reminded me of a picture of an hourglass on the front of a book. I'm sure that many of you have seen it, entitled Decision Time, where it too had a few grains of sand left in it. Just prior to Lehi's passing, he shared a few words with his son Jacob, and I would like to read those for you. 2 Nephi chapter 1, starting with the 65th verse. For the Spirit is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and the way is prepared from the fall of man, and salvation is free. And men are instructed sufficiently that they know good from evil. And the law is given unto men. And by the law no flesh is justified, or by the law men are cut off. Yea, by the temporal law they were cut off, and also by the spiritual law they perish from that which is good, and become miserable forever. Wherefore, redemption cometh in and through the Holy Messiah, for he is full of grace and truth. Behold, he offereth himself a sacrifice for sin, to answer the ends of the law, unto all those who have a broken heart and a contrite spirit, and unto none else can the ends of the law be answered. Wherefore, how great the importance to make these things known unto the inhabitants of the earth, that they may know that there is no flesh that can dwell in the presence of God, save it be through the merits and mercy and the grace of the Holy Messiah, who layeth down his life according to the flesh, and taketh it again by the power of the Spirit, that he may bring to pass the resurrection of the dead, being the first that should rise. Wherefore, he is the firstfruits unto God, inasmuch as he shall make intercession for all children of men. And they believe in him, and they that believe in him shall be saved. And because of the intercession for all men come unto God. I'd like to close this evening with a testimony or an experience. It's kind of a lengthy one. It's an experience of a young man that attended Blue Valley State. And I was drawn to the experience because I was a young man that attended Blue Valley State. And as I read his experience, I noticed the similarities between the both of us. And I read it so many times that I can almost repeat it by heart. And in that experience, the young man, the congregation that he attended, there were men that were spiritual leaders in the congregation, and he recognized them as spiritual leaders. Congregation that I attended, there were men in the congregation that were spiritual leaders. He mentions in his experience that one of the men that had the greatest impact upon his life was the pastor. In my life at East Alton, it was the same. That one of the men that had the greatest impact upon my life was the pastor. And he went on to share the fact that he had been called to the priesthood at a very early age. And I found it quite odd and ironic that I was called to the priesthood at a very young age. And he had the very same feelings that I had. That in his experience, and as he led up to the experience, as he explained, he gave some foreground knowledge of where he was coming from in his life. That when he said that he was called at an early age, it wasn't out of boasting. That he had struggled with many of the feelings that he had trying to be a teenager and a priesthood member. The congregation that he attended went on weekend retreats in southern Missouri. And it just so happens that I attended a congregation where we attended weekend retreats in southern Missouri. And this particular experience was a weekend retreat at a lake. And his family attended, members of the congregation and their families attended, and they had fun and they had fellowship. And it was determined that Sunday morning that they would have a prayer service. And they were camping in a campground at a lake, and the campground was at the foot of a mountain. And the elders that were in the service had found a location to have the prayer service, and it happened to be at the top of the mountain. There was a picnic area. And as Sunday morning came and the appointed time, they all loaded up in their cars and they all drove to the top of the mountain. And the service proceeded, and as the service proceeded, the young man shares that he noticed that the Spirit enveloped them. And he began to pray and he began to meditate. And as he began to pray and he began to meditate, he was made aware that one of the gentlemen up front would stand and call his name. He didn't know why. He returned to his prayer, and at that appointed time, he heard a voice. And the voice was familiar to him, but it was somewhat different. Because the voice spoke with a different type of an authority. The voice that he heard was his father's. And initially he thought that the pastor was going to stand up and was going to speak to him. But he was facing his father. And as he looked in his father's eyes, he says that he felt as though that he could look right into his soul. And what he understood to be under the influence of the Spirit, he was directed to go find a family member that had separated themselves from the prayer service. The Lord had an urgency to speak with him. And so the young man rose and stood and turned, and he started on his journey down the gravel road that led from the picnic area to the blacktop, which would take him down the mountain. And as he walked along the gravel road, he was made aware on his right side, because there were trees along the right side, but there were no trees on the left side, that there was a presence, and it was following him, and it was watching him. And the presence was in the shadows. And he mentions that it was in the shadows and that it wouldn't step out into the light because there was no light in it. And the young man says that he began to fear for his life. And he began to say a prayer. And as he began to say the prayer, he felt a second presence at his right side, separating him from the other presence that he had originally felt. And his fear began to leave him, and he continued on his journey. But just as the fear began to leave him, doubt started to creep into his mind. And he began to think of ways in which that he could return to the service, that he reasoned within his mind that he would tell the elders that he had tried to find. He had searched for the young man that he had been sent after, but he could not find him. And just as that thought had crept into his mind, a still voice mentioned to him, one step right after another, by your faith, I will lead you. The young man shares that he tried to turn himself one way or the other way, physically, tried to remove himself from the steps that he was taking, but he couldn't do it. And still he went on his way down the road. He again considered returning to the elders and telling them that he had searched for the young man, but he couldn't find him. There was just no finding him. And again, the thoughts that came to his mind was one step after another. By your faith, I will lead you. And as he walked down the road, down the mountainside, sure enough, he didn't turn to the left, he didn't turn to the right. His footsteps were led straight to the edge of the lake, where he found this young man sitting in a chair. And when he looked down, and the young man that he had been sent after happened to be his cousin. And he said when he looked down, he saw in his countenance a darkness. And then when he looked in his eyes, that the person that was looking back at him wasn't his cousin. And before he even had a chance to approach his cousin, he muttered the words, I know why you're here. I'm not going back. And immediately the young man says that he searched and he searched and he searched for words that he thought that he could implore this other young man to return with him. And finally, the only thing that came out was, "The Lord loves you." He's concerned about you. You need to return with me, for he has wisdom that he needs to share with you. And the young man continued to struggle with him, and he thought he would never get him out of the chair. He thought he would never get him to rise. He thought he was going to have to return to the prayer service, and that he was going to have to share the news that he had found him, but that he wasn't going to return. But somehow and in some way, in his words, he convinced his cousin to rise up out of the chair and to walk with him. And the journey back wasn't an easy journey. The journey back was a difficult journey. Several times on the way back, his cousin, being bigger than him, physically placed his hands upon his shoulders. And even at one point, pleading with him, he threatened physical violence. And the young man once again shares that, again, he prayed, and as soon as he began to pray, that his cousin released him, and he began to cry. They made their way back up the mountain and up the gravel road. And as they approached the prayer service, the pastor was standing and he was speaking to a young lady that was in the group. The young man took his place back where he had been seated. And as he sat down, he heard the pastor say, "Thus saith the Spirit, Amen." And he had watched his cousin go to his right and sit down on the bench. And he turned and he looked. His cousin wasn't there. At the end of the service, all of the elders up front approached a young man, and the only thing that they said to him was, "You've done yourself well this day as a deacon." The group returned to the campsite, and in the young man's writings, he expresses that he was confused. He was upset. He had prepared, and he had come in the spirit of expectancy. There was many concerns upon his heart. He also did not understand the response of the elders from up front. Some weeks later, in another prayer service, the young man was shared that there will be times when I will call you and you will feel all alone. And I will ask you to go out and to serve my people. But one step after another, by your faith, I will lead you. The young man that had this experience penned this sometime later on in his life. And I found it interesting because at the very end of the experience, he shares that his cousin's life fell apart. That his cousin's life was lost to alcohol and drugs. And that as they grew old, that he was but a shell of himself in his older age. And it made me think and ponder. Had the young man, the cousin, chosen to return to the service, to hear the words of encouragement and love that his Heavenly Father had for him, what might have been the change in his life? What might his life been from that experience? And the answer is because we all have to make that choice to make the change in our life. We all have to make that decision to open our hearts so that we can allow that transforming change to take place within us.